Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How you doing, Nick?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
Busy, busy, busy. I'm sure you're doing the same. You're feeling the AP squeeze right now.
Yes, 1 week left for the test, so hopefully the kids are all studying today. I have a few videos to put up on YouTube when we're done with this podcast as well.
Oh, very nice, very nice. I'm sure they're working hard. I know that you see the stress level of students at this time of year is, especially the more conscientious ones, are off the charts right now.
I think I've seen that more than ever this year. The number of AP classes that kids are taking combined with the SATs, it's really, I think they have to reevaluate the scheduling because having the SATs this past Saturday and then 1 week later starting the AP exams is very difficult for them.
Why would you say that?
just a little bit much. Oh, and try to squeeze in a junior prom while you're at it.
That's right. And varsity sports and
Yes.
everything else that the kids do. But so we have a busy show today. We have a couple of pretty big topics. One huge topic, which is tenure, which I know we wanted to talk about. And in the methods lab, we wanted to discuss testing, since that was a theme a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing the state exams. So let's jump right into it, because this is definitely a highly debatable and highly debated topic, and I know that it's really come under fire a lot recently with Governor Cuomo's changes here in New York State and the recent educational new mandates. I feel like there are always new mandates lately, but so let's talk about tenure and a little bit about the history of tenure and what it is. And so, how do you define tenure for those who perhaps are unfamiliar?
I feel like my understanding of tenure historically was to provide protection for teachers against unfair dismissals from their job, but whether it be for teachers who were on the college level, maybe for political reasons. I know that I've taught my students, even like in the 1920s, sometimes female teachers were dismissed for wearing pants.
That's right.
And I think there was like some sort of a conference in the late 1800s, same time where labor, factory workers were trying to unionize, teachers were trying to do the same thing. And I think now, when we think about tenure, it's as you said, such a hot button issue. But I'm not sure if the concerns are the same as far as job protection as they were back then.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I actually came across a Time magazine piece from a few years ago that is actually discussing Michelle Rhee back when she was trying to conquer the world. And they talk a little bit about the history of tenure, and it started in New Jersey. And they were really trying to protect women from being fired for getting married or getting pregnant, and like you said, wearing pants, which is so absurd. But I think now what's happened is it's become this thing where if you could make it through the probationary period, whether it's 3 years or out in California it's even less, then you pretty much get an ironclad lifetime contract, which is similar to almost the Supreme Court in terms of a lifetime appointment. And I think that's a huge problem, and that has come under fire in the Vergara versus California case, which has nothing to do with Sofia Vergara and her and her eggs. I know there's something going on there with her ex-boyfriend and all kinds of lunacy that can only happen in California, I think. But anyway, so the Vergara case really brings out a lot of this as well, and so do the new changes that Governor Cuomo is proposing.
Yeah, you bring up that Vergara versus California case, and I was unaware that teachers in Los Angeles get tenure as early as after 18 months on the job.
That's right. I actually read 16 months or sooner.
Yeah, and that's that's absurd. We can discuss what we think would be appropriate in a few minutes, but in that case where the students were trying to get rid of teachers who they felt were ineffective, I think that brought a lot of attention to how easy it might be to get tenure in certain localities. And,
That's right.
And I guess it's Campbell Brown now, right? The CNN, who's really been instrumental in the movement to get tenure basically abolished. But I always use the analogy with the way we award tenure. First of all, 3 years. I don't know how you feel. I do think that's too short amount
I
of
agree.
time. But I think one of the well, two of the issues. Number one, I feel as if tenure seems to be brought up when the economy is poor. When people aren't doing well economically, that's when people are all concerned about the perks and the benefits that teachers have and the protections that they have
Hmm.
in their job.
Hmm.
I don't remember when the economy was strong, everybody rushing to think we have the greatest jobs in
Right.
the
Or
country.
during the tech boom.
Right.
Yeah.
But the second issue, I do think the period should be longer, but we award jobs, or I should say award, we provide job descriptions to a 25-year seasoned veteran teacher that are exactly the same as a first year teacher out of college. And I don't think we would offer the same thing to, let's say, a brain surgeon. I don't think we would. I don't think we would say to the person who's been operating for 20 years to give him the same job. There's got to be some sort of an apprentice period where you build up to that point, and with that, a much longer probationary period to award tenure.
Right. I think I shared this with you once before. I always envisioned like a much better tenure. First of all, let me I guess back up. I do believe in tenure, and I do believe in unions, and I do believe in protecting people from bosses who are flippant and maybe have no clue what they're doing. And the very things that I would argue should be for teachers should also be the standard held for principals and assistant principals and superintendents. So this is by no means simply a teacher thing. To me, this is anyone who's working in education should have certain job protections and should also have certain standards that are required of them that are substantial because it is an incredibly important profession. So what I'm saying is not simply just directed towards teachers, but I always believe that there should be almost a series of 3 year periods where, for example, almost like trimesters, your first 3 years, the administrative team would need to have or meet a certain standard in order to dismiss you. And then after you pass that first phase, you would have another 3 year phase where they would have to meet a different standard. It would make it a little bit more difficult, but yet not impossible to dismiss a teacher. And I say the word impossible because when you look at the statistics, for example, in Vergara, they cite the following: 275,000 teachers statewide, 2.2 are dismissed for unsatisfactory performance, which is 0.0008%. And then I have another stat, an article on Cuomo, which cites, let me see if I can quickly find it for you. Over a 10-year period studied 1997 to 2007, just 12 of New York City teachers, of whom there are 75,000 at any given time, were dismissed for incompetent teaching. So something's really, really wrong. And I'll rarely agree with Governor Cuomo, but in this particular case, he's right. There's something wrong with the number of teachers who are weeded out for incompetence. You just can't tell me statistically that there are only 12 or only 8 or only 7 out of tens of thousands of people. I don't care what the profession is. There's got to be some group, some standard deviation, some part of the bell curve that just isn't getting the job done, and they just can't stay. It's just too important a job. And when they're standing in front of 150 students or more a year, you just can't afford. How many years do you let that go before you have an ineffective teacher who's I guess performing, if you will, in front of thousands of students over a lifetime? It's something is very, very wrong there.
Yeah, and I think with the attention that was brought to the rubber room in New York City, I know
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
couple of the newspapers here were focusing on teachers who are in, I guess, a holding period, so they're still getting paid. They show up to this room and they do clerical work all day, and they're getting paid fairly decent salaries,
Hmm.
and that enraged people. But it should enrage everybody. Now, I will also
Wait, you're
say,
assuming they're doing clerical work and not crossword puzzles or
right.
words with friends.
Right, right, but we also hope that those people can be quickly given, a fair, I guess, trial or
Hearing. Hmm.
hearing. Yeah, so because I would feel bad if there are some people there who should not be dismissed.
That's right. And to further that point, we should not have a system where a commissioner or a superintendent or a principal or someone has a nephew or a niece that they want to have a job for,
Right.
and they just summarily, dismiss someone who is perfectly competent, perfectly effective, just because they want to create an opening. Or even worse, you have veteran teachers who are excellent at what they do, but now they're creeping up on the pay scale
Right.
and they want to cut back on budgets, and they're going to start getting rid of those people simply for dollars and cents. That can't be
Right.
allowed also. So we have to find a way to protect that and to protect the people who are really doing a wonderful job, who are doing everything that anyone could possibly ask of them. And I'm talking about from the teacher ranks all the way up to the administrative ranks, and be able to protect those jobs earnestly. And but yet at the same time make it possible, humanly possible, because right now it's almost impossible to dismiss someone who's completely ineffective. And the reality is, and you know it as well as I do, Nick, you don't need state tests to determine who that is. And as a matter of fact, the new system that the governor's put in place, what he doesn't realize is completely working against his agenda to get rid of the least effective teachers, because some students will do well in these exams in spite of the worst instructors imaginable standing in front of them. So this is not the way to do it. The reality is, and you know as well as I do, that for the most part in each building, if you ask people privately who the least effective teachers in the building are, there's probably agreement as to who that person or those individuals are, just because it's known. These are just known things in buildings.
Yeah, but I agree. But I also sometimes think that uh, outside of school, there's a perception that there are just so many ineffective teachers, and I think that's wrong. I do think there's a small number,
I
but
agree.
but I think sometimes the public has this perception that there are just an incredible amount of lazy, ineffective teachers, and I think that, but I think it's very dangerous the way we evaluate them. There are some. I think almost every teacher, you can look at the same classroom, and some kids love the teacher and think that they're great. Some
Hmm.
parents love the teacher, think they're fantastic.
That's right.
That same teacher might have other people in the class that do not like them, that do not think that they're effective. But I always say to kids, different teaching styles are going to work better with some students than other. But as a student, you have to learn how to manage that, because you're
Hmm.
going to have all different types of teachers throughout your educational experience, just like you're probably going to have different types of bosses with different managerial styles.
Hmm.
So that's part of it. But I just don't. It's they're all connected. The testing is not going to help to evaluate and to determine which of these teachers should be continued in their profession and which we should try to move along with.
Agreed, agreed. But let's look at some of the specific points that the students or the plaintiffs in Vergara brought up. There were three in particular. One is the permanent employment statute. And basically, how they define it is the permanent employment law forces administrators to either grant or deny permanent employment to teachers after an evaluation period of less than 16 months, before new teachers even complete their beginner teacher induction programs, and before administrators are able to assess whether a teacher will be effective long term. Now, we could, I think we've joked about this in the past, you could get tenure in New York State in 3 years, but they give you 5 years to complete your license requirements. So you could have a job for life before you even have a license for life.
Yeah.
So, which they don't even exist anymore. Everything's provisional now. Anyway, there's no more permanent certification in New York State. But that's just absurd. That again, the 3 year concept is something that has always plagued me in terms of trying to wrap my head around it. And listen, we both enjoy tenure that we both received after 3 years of satisfactory performance, and that's wonderful. But yet at the same time, I can honestly say that I've never woken up and looked myself in the mirror and said I'm going to do anything differently today because I have tenure versus the days that I didn't have tenure.
Right.
Another one of the pieces that they discuss in the Vergara case, dismissal statutes, and the way they define it. The process for dismissing a single ineffective teacher involves a borderline infinite number of steps, requires years of documentation, costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, and still rarely ever works. And then they go ahead and provide the statistic, the 2.2 teachers out of 275,000. And the last one, and this one I'd like to get your opinion on, is the last in, first out layoff statute, which requires basically if there are going to be layoffs within a district, it's done on the basis of seniority, regardless of or irregardless of giving consideration to how the teacher performs in the classroom. So, what are your thoughts about the last in, first out?
Well, that one I think I'm going to have to agree with simply because I'm going to be concerned about something you brought up earlier, and that is the financial ramifications of dismissing students. I'm sorry, dismissing dismissing teachers. I
Right.
think I'd be concerned that they will get rid of the teachers that are the most expensive. So I think if we get to a point where we're awarding tenure on a different basis, last in, first out won't matter because we'll be happy and we'll be content with all the people who we have awarded tenure to. I'm not sure if you disagree, but
I, I'm really on the fence on this one because again, I want to make sure that it's fair. To me, that's fairness is incredibly important. I never want someone to be dismissed unfairly. But at the same time, when you have someone who's dynamic, who's a game changing individual who comes into your building or into your department and they're just blowing the lid off the thing and there's a cutback and they're the first to go, it's almost criminal to take that person out of the room. And that, to me, that's a problem also.
yeah, I do understand your concerns there. But this might be one where we just slightly, I guess, maybe disagree.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think if, which, by the way, my aunt wants us to disagree a little bit more, just so you know, on the podcast. But I feel as, again, if we get the right method for evaluating teachers and award tenure on a different basis, I don't think last in, first out. I don't think that's going to be the primary concern.
So I'm not sure where there's continuity in these ideas.
I think they want to bring the data driven world that we're living in today to education. And I guess when there's a company and they have to, make a determination on layoffs, they have more data to use. If it's a company that's, if it's based on a sales department, they have numbers. It's a little bit it's more concrete. And they our first three episodes they all kind of combine together. They want to use that to evaluate teachers and to make determinations on layoffs and promotions and later on maybe we'll talk about merit pay. I just don't see how it works. And I think we're trying to make a model fit in education that doesn't.
That's true. And I guess another element, just to bring it in, is how people respond to tenure and how people handle tenure. And you've seen this run the gamut, as have I, where there are people who are just as humble on their first day as they are on their last day of the job, and they work very hard and they do everything that they can to fulfill all their professional responsibilities. And then you have some people who walk around as if they have diplomatic immunity once they receive tenure. And that to me is problematic also. And this is where when it becomes almost impossible to dismiss somebody and when it just becomes such a tremendous mountain to have to climb that people don't want to do it because it's not worth on the administrative side. They just can't justify the amount of time and the money and the effort that is going to be required in order to at least try to get the person dismissed, that it almost after a while they almost try to work around it instead of kind of tackling the problem that exists. In one of the articles from just to support it with some numbers, and this is coming from I think it was a Daily News article that I'll put on the web. But according to New York State School Boards Association, the average 3020A proceeding, which we'll talk about in a second, for a single incompetent teacher extends for 830 days and costs taxpayers $313,000. See, to me, that's tremendously problematic because when you go to a commissioner or you go to a superintendent and when you go to whoever's in charge of a district and you say, okay, we've identified a teacher who is not where we want them to be, and we have to consider dismissing them. They start those numbers, 830 days, $313,000. That starts to factor into the equation, and they have to make a decision as to whether or not they even want to open up that door and walk through. And very often the answer is no.
See, and those stories that appear sometimes in the Daily News, the New York Post, the really extreme cases where I think everybody would agree. I mean, criminal acts. Teachers that have been arrested for violent criminal offenses, and not charged, convicted, and they still have a difficult time removing them. Would you agree? Everybody would say we have to get rid of them in a timely fashion.
I would, but just look at our judicial system on a
Right.
whole. I mean, the Sarnaev brother who's surviving still in court. I mean, this is 2 years now to pretty much almost to the day when the Boston Marathon took place. And I mean, I understand fairness, but there has to be some type of a little bit swifter fairness, a swifter justice. And these proceedings also have to be sped up, which we'll talk about in a minute, because that's part of the 3020B proceedings that the governor has proposed. But I'm
See,
sorry, I interrupted
no,
your point.
well, you didn't interrupt my point. You stole my point. That's exactly what I'm saying. This is not something that's isolated, I don't think, to education. I think this is a problem with our judicial system. My point though is that in those cases, everybody's in agreement. There are teachers that should be dismissed for those horrific offenses. I just don't know if the Daily News puts 7 people on the front of the paper. Well, then the public sometimes reads this and says, "Oh, look at the New York City teachers, that they're all doing this," and
Right.
that's not fair, because it is a small number. Now, the teachers who have tenure, who maybe administrators would like to push a little bit harder, they're not doing anything illegal, but feel as if they should just be working harder. That we then have to start to develop action plans, and you have to lay out for the teachers, this is what we'd like you to do better, these are the efforts we'd like you to make more in the classroom, outside of the classroom, but not this is what your test scores are, just get the test scores up, because that's when teachers will then just say, all right, I'll teach to the test if that's what they want.
Right, but you're right. However, I apologize to your aunt that I'm agreeing with you, but uh, I'll give you a perfect example, and this is sort of hilarious. My dad, who was an assistant principal in an elementary school in Brooklyn for 20 some odd years, he had a teacher who was an Orthodox Jewish woman. She was a Sabbath observer, and in the wintertime when sundown came early, and this is elementary school, the teachers with the class all day. My father would be outside, the main office hallway, and he would see this woman walking with her coat on, bag over her shoulder, at like 2:30, and school ends at 3 o'clock. And she would say to him, "Okay, I have to go prepare for the Sabbath," and she would walk out of the building, and her class was in her classroom. And she walked around, she was tenured, and she had this she walked around with diplomatic immunity, and there was nothing they could do. The only thing my father could do was to run upstairs and cover the class for 30 minutes or 25 minutes, whatever it was, until the bell, because that teacher was gone. And there was nothing that he could do about it, or the principal could do about it. So I mean, that's just one isolated example, and it's sort of absurd, but it does encapsulate some of this bravado that sometimes in rare cases like this, a tenured teacher sort of carries with him or her, because they feel like, go ahead, try to come after me, because there's literally practically almost nothing that you could do about it, and that to me is a problem. So people just have to have, like in the business world, they have to have a healthy respect for their employer, and they have to be, and most people do, but some don't. They have to have a healthy respect for their employer and their professional obligations and responsibilities. And if they feel like there's no repercussion, or there are no ramifications for their actions, human beings in general, not whether they're teachers or not, won't. To me, that's problematic.
But the question is, what percentage of teachers are like that. And I'd like to think, maybe I'm a little idealistic, that it is not a high number.
It's not, but when you start playing the numbers game and you start looking at hundreds of thousands of children in in Nassau County or in Suffolk County where we are, or the 1.1 million children that are in New York City, even if you're talking about 1% of the teachers or even a half of 1% of the teachers, you're still talking about tens of thousands of children who are being impacted by those individuals. And that goes back to the Vergara case. That's not fair. Not that I support the decision of Vergara, but you have to at least recognize that it's hugely problematic. And those are real kids, and those are real lives, and those are real families that are being impacted.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that.
Whew, got that one out. So I just want to, just to close up the topic here, talk about the new 3020B proceedings versus the 3020A proceeding, which has been sort of the long time regulation to dismiss or process to dismiss a teacher. So the changes that Cuomo is looking to make essentially are as follows. Districts will be charged. This is coming from this article. Districts will be allowed to charge a teacher with incompetence after he or she earns two ineffective ratings in a row, and the proceedings would have an expedited 90-day timeline. A teacher will have to provide evidence that they are effective to win an appeal hearing. So I guess for the first time in American history, the you are guilty until proven innocent, and the burden of proof is on the defendant versus the plaintiff. But I guess that goes back to the 12 tables of Rome. So I guess he's overturning that as well. Sorry for the geeky historical references for those of you who are not history people. And then the other part of that is districts will be required to bring charges against teachers who earn three ineffective ratings in a row with a 30-day timeline for the proceedings. A teacher will have to prove fraud to win an appeal. What are your thoughts about the new 3020B?
My thoughts is I'm very concerned about the process for what's determining ineffectiveness. That's the bottom line is how do we define ineffectiveness? And if we're using test scores as a large segment of that, then I disagree.
And I agree. I agree with you because this is where we come back to a lack of fairness, and this is where the state is cooking the books. The governor is they're almost retrofitting these changes to work into a particular narrative that they want to tell or that they have convinced themselves of, and they are now going to increase the level of the level that tests count towards your APPR, and they're going to expedite the dismissal process, and they're going to make the tests even more challenging, and they're going to lower the cut scores or raise the cut scores, however you want to look at it, to make the results even worse because they have it in their heads that an overwhelming preponderance of teachers in this state are ineffective, and they want to essentially break the back of the teachers union. To me, that's what's going on here. That's the big game that they're trying to play, and it's not about any of these small changes. They're trying to do something big. They're trying to kind of take away local control. They're trying to create larger, more unified, centralized school districts that they can completely oversee and that they can manipulate based on what they want. And this is all part and parcel of that. And that to me is the scariest part. So, all the things I spoke of before, I truly believe in. I believe in fairness and I want all those things, but not this way. Because this is just a power grab and this is just an attempt to break the back of the union. And I have a huge problem with that.
Yeah. And when you really take yourself completely away from the entire system, just think about the fact that they want to use a test for 3rd through 8th graders to evaluate a teacher, yet this test has absolutely no tangible benefit or significance to the student at all. It's not used for graduation. It's not used for a marking period grade. It's not used for any substance for a student. So we tell a kid, take this test. The only reason you should be motivated to do well in this test is for yourself to feel good about yourself. An 11-year-old, that's what you think that all 11-year-olds are going to take this test as seriously as possible?
No, now we're asking them to please take the test and do their best to help your teacher and
Yeah.
save your teacher's rear end.
Right. Yeah. Oh,
And that's
but
completely
my
unfair.
but my teacher gave me a detention for coming too late 3 days in a row. I'm not going. But we're going back with the same topics here. But they all are connected, and it's troubling. That's the part that's very troubling.
We definitely agree on that. And since we're talking about tests, let's talk about classroom tests, like the legitimate kind, the kind that we create versus the kind that Pearson creates. So, in your opinion, what should a classroom test look like?
I like to vary up my tests all the time. Now, obviously, I'm a social studies teacher, so my tests are going to be largely based on content and skills. And I really think that sometimes teachers might try to put too much into one test. So, for example, I will definitely separate tests that have multiple choice questions versus essay tests. I think sometimes we try to have kids do everything at once, and then their essay becomes a 10-minute exam or 10-minute portion of it for
Hmm.
them. So I like to separate them. But there's a lot of times where I'll come into class and tell the kids we're taking a test, but it's not a test that I'm necessarily going to put in the book either. I like to be able to gauge what they've remembered from the last week just from what we've discussed in class and what they've done outside. And at first, kids get a little bit, surprised by that. Oh no, we're taking a test. I mean, a test can be me just verbally asking the class questions to evaluate what they know. And as the year goes on, actually, they kind of enjoy that a little bit, almost like a
Hmm.
joint effort. Uh,
Hmm.
but I do think it's very important when they are evaluated. I think we really need to, especially with the essay writing, because if they're not sitting for 40 and 50-minute essays throughout the year, I don't know how well they're going to be prepared when college, I'm assuming, is still focusing largely on written exams.
You mean college does more than remedial coursework now?
We hope. We hope.
We definitely hope. So, when you give these exams, assuming that it's not a surprise quiz or something like that, do you take time and review in class?
I have moved away from that, and I've used technology really to help facilitate that. If there is some sort of review that I'm going to do with students, I'll do a review online. Put a review video on my YouTube page. That's been effective. Sometimes I can have the kids work on the review themselves at home. But usually, if it's like an essay test, I will say I'll do a video to review for it, and then I'll have the kids email me any questions that they have. Sometimes they'll send me their first opening paragraphs to make sure that their thesis statements are strong. But I don't think we really have the luxury anymore because there's just so much you want to be able to do in the classroom to then take an extra period every time you're giving a test to review. So for me, it's not that I'm against it. It's that I don't think it's the most effective way to utilize the face-to-face time that I have with students.
Right, I definitely agree with that. And perhaps maybe the first exam that you give in a year, the students don't really know how you're going to test them, what you're going to ask, what kind of questions, and so on. Just to kind of ease them into what you're doing in terms of your assessments, it's probably worth reviewing, let's say, that first test or maybe even that second test. But once they get a hang of what your tests are going to look like and what they're expected to know and so on, I think you could work away from that because one of the problems, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is one of the things that I'm concerned with in terms of review. In a perfect world, providing all kinds of review is wonderful because if time is unlimited, then why not spend the time in review? However, time is very scarce in classrooms. And if you give that time to review, then first of all, you cut into your instructional time. You cut into time where they can learn new things and be creative, and you can be creative, and then it crunches the other time that you have available. And then what happens? Very often, people feel like they're pressed for time, and they have to cover things quickly, which turns into bulleted PowerPoint presentations and just cramming important essential information into the kids' notebooks or into their brains. And then you lose all the skill development. So you need to get that time back. And one of the ways to get that time back is to cut out review, in class review. You could always do outside of class review. That's wonderful. Before school, after school, during the day. The other problem that I have, and that's the self fulfilling prophecy part, is if a student comes into your class and 2 days before the test, you're doing 2 days worth of review, they won't study on their own because they're going to get everything that they need within your time, within your
Right.
class time. And then that's where the self-fulfilling prophecy comes in. You want them to study on their own, but you've taken away any incentive that they could possibly have to study on their own, because you've given them a safety net and scaffolding, and you've put wires on them, you've connected them. So they have no risk whatsoever. They could just show up and they're good to go. And I think if you want to get them to do more, the way you get students to do more is not by doing more for them, it's actually by doing less for them and giving them the ability to do more on their own.
And that's also why I have really moved more towards essay exams than multiple choice exams, because of what you said about the students. If there's an essay test or any written component, well, they have to study, because if they don't study, they're going to come to class and there's going to be a blank piece of paper in front of them.
Right.
But when it's a multiple choice test, the students, there isn't that fear factor, because they know I can put some answer down. I'll be able to write something.
Right.
And if I get lucky, I'll get a 72, because I just kind of got lucky. I knew a couple of answers. So I think when it's an essay exam, they have to. Now, of course, that doesn't help in math. That doesn't help necessarily in science. I get that. Although I guess there are some components of those subjects which could be written. But even in a math exam, they have to be able to figure out the problems. Again, if it's a multiple choice math exam, they can write something. They don't have to worry about it.
Right. And in a multiple choice math exam or math example, they're going to have to do so much more work anyway in order to find out what that answer is, as opposed to a social studies multiple choice, which is essentially looking at it and answering it versus having to actually work through some type of algorithm or process in order to determine what the answer is.
Yep. Good point.
So I wanted to, before we call it a day, I wanted to just discuss with you something that has gone viral. It's that video. I'm sorry. It's the question, the math problem from Singapore. When is Cheryl's birthday? I don't know if you came across this, but they actually had it in the Times a couple of weeks ago. And a television host from Singapore put this posting on his Facebook page, and it became this huge, internet sensation. Here in America, it's Kim Kardashian's rear end, but in Singapore, it's a logic problem. So, maybe that talks about the differences between our cultures. But essentially, it's two individuals, and Albert and Bernard, and they meet a woman named Cheryl. And Albert asks Cheryl, "When's your birthday?" And Cheryl says, "I'm not going to tell you, but I'll give you some clues." And she writes down a list of 10 dates. And she says, "My birthday is one of these." And Cheryl whispers into Albert's ear the month. And to Bernard, she whispers only the day. And she asks Albert, "Can you figure it out now?" And Albert says, "I can't." But he knows that the other guy, Bernard, doesn't know either. And Bernard said, "I didn't originally know, but now I do." And Albert says, "Well, now I know too." And you have to basically take that information and figure out when Cheryl's birthday is. So I put a link to that on the show notes, because I thought it was, first of all, it's an interesting question, and some people will get it right away, and some people will struggle with it a little bit. But for two reasons: one, it's interesting, and two, it just shows what constitutes a viral, something of interest in one culture versus another.
I look forward to seeing that. I'll check out the show notes as soon as you post them.
And then, so in response to this, Nicholas Kristoff, who's one of our favorites, I know, he posted a column where he basically asks, "Are you smarter than an eighth grader?" I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at that. It was, I think, in last Sunday's Times.
Yes, I think I did see that one.
And that one basically goes through some very basic algebra questions and talks about which students are getting it right in different countries versus America. Surprise, surprise, America's not doing well in math, according to this. But I just thought it would be a fun thing to take a look at, and it is kind of an interesting read. And both things are maybe worth sharing with your students. If you, whether or not you teach math or not, a logic problem is perfectly fine as a bonus question on a homework or something like that.
It's teaching thinking, which is what we're supposed to be doing.
That kind of wraps up our podcast for today. If you'd like to follow us on iTunes, please feel free to look in the iTunes store and subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment there. You can find us on the web at stateofedpodcast.com. You could also ask us questions or send comments in. Or if you have any topics that you'd like to suggest and have Nick and I discuss, you could do that at ask@stateofedpodcast.com. You could also follow us on Twitter at SOE Podcast. And that's our podcast for this week. Have a great week, Nick.
You too, Mark. Take care.